President Trump said that if Putin messed him around, he would bomb it out of Moscow. Now, one of the weapons that is at his disposal is the Joint Air-to-Surface standoff missile, the JASSM, which is an air-launched cruise missile, got a range of about 230 miles. It's about 1,000 pounds in weight. It's stealthy, and of course it can be carried on the F-16, which of course the F-16s are now in service with the Ukrainian Air Force. That, although its actual range would struggle to reach Moscow, if the F-16s were to go across the border, then it could get there. The point being is that Trump has been saying there's a whole wealth of weapons, as has Mark Rutte, the NATO SecGen. So it'll be really interesting to see whether Trump is only providing defensive weapons, or, as appears to be the case, is he's unlocked the treasure chest and actually is allowing some offensive weapons as well.
With me, the military analyst Sean Bell, to talk through Donald Trump's announcement of new arms for Ukraine. Sean, massive supplies of American weapons are promised, worth billions of dollars. Is Donald Trump's announcement going to shift things for Kyiv?
It's been a fascinating 24 hours, hasn't it? I think for me, the danger is we get sort of focused on the numbers and the weapons. I think what's the most important thing is that ever since President Trump came into office, he's been looking to sort of blame Zelensky, blame the West for the war, and he's trying to be doing some sort of deal with President Putin, olive branches, lots of bonhomie going on. Whereas actually what's happened now, it does appear that President Trump's finally realised that President Putin is not for turning. And actually, all of a sudden now, he seems to be roundly supporting President Zelensky. So I do think that is the key issue here. Unfortunately, as a military guy, I've never had any faith in purely using sanctions to stop Putin. Putin will only stop. History shows that these sorts of things only stop when Putin is forced to stop. What do I mean by that? Either militarily or through crippling sanctions and tariffs. They, to my money, are the only two ways you're going to be able to force President Putin to stop. Sending him nice letters, claiming it's all awful and there's people dying, I know captures the public sympathy, but bluntly, for a dictator like Putin, he's got to be stopped. And I think this is the first step to recognising that by the US president.
If we look at the details, they're a little bit hazy so far, but you're an ex-RAF man, with your military hat on. What kind of capability will these additional Patriot air defence systems and other things bring for Ukraine? What will they add to the fight?
Yeah, I think there's three categories that, for my money, have been advertised. One of which is, as you say, the Patriot system. There's a lot made of that. And please don't get me wrong, it's a very capable missile system. It's ideally situated to deal with ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. But the bulk of what's hitting Ukraine nightly is the drones. I note that on Tuesday last week, I think the numbers were 728 drones were struck. They're expecting it to get up to 1,000 a night by the end of this month. And of course, Patriot is not the answer to drones. I've no doubt they can shoot them down, but when you're talking about a multi-million-pound Patriot missile to shoot down a $1,000 drone, it just doesn't make sense. They just would run out of stocks in one night. So Patriot is the headline, but in reality, what they will need is ways of shooting down or destroying or disrupting or degrading these drones as they come across. So that's the headline. I think there's potentially some other defensive weapons. The two other things, though, from a military perspective, one of which, for the first time, President Trump talked about tariffs. He talked about the potential of 100% tariffs. One of the things that is pretty clear to me, I'm not an economist, but if you were to put 100% tariff on oil and also those same tariffs on any country buying Russian oil, all of a sudden now that would change the dynamics and stop President Putin funding this war. That would create a great deal of difficulty for President Putin. The only thing I'm a bit confused about is why there's this 50-day delay before these sanctions are introduced. But the third element is that we talked about defensive weapons, but you're not going to win a war simply by packing everybody on your goal line. You win by actually going on the offense. And offensive weapons are what Ukraine desperately needs at the moment. And whilst there's no talk of exactly what's been entailed, you do remember that President Trump said that if Putin messed him around, he would bomb it out of Moscow. Now, one of the weapons that is at his disposal is the Joint Air-to-Surface standoff missile, the JASSM, which is an air-launched cruise missile, got a range of about 230 miles. It's about 1,000 pounds in weight. It's stealthy, and of course it can be carried on the F-16, which of course the F-16s are now in service with the Ukrainian Air Force. That, although its actual range would struggle to reach Moscow, if the F-16s were to go across the border, then it could get there. The point being is that Trump has been saying there's a whole wealth of weapons, as has Mark Rutte, the NATO SecGen. So it'll be really interesting to see whether Trump is only providing defensive weapons, or, as appears to be the case, is he's unlocked the treasure chest and actually is allowing some offensive weapons as well.
Mark Rutte, the Secretary General, was sat beside Trump for this announcement. We're told NATO will pay for the weapons. Trump seems more keen on the alliance than he has been for a long time. Do you think Rutte's presence there was symbolism, perhaps?
It's interesting, isn't it? I think, right, let's unpack that a little bit. The implication is that America in some way was sort of wavering on its support to NATO. I was around, obviously, when the last administration for Trump was there. And I have to say, less than a third of NATO members actually paid their way. We did as a nation, but Trump made clear that was not satisfactory. When he comes back into power, it's still only 2/3 of NATO members paying their way. So I don't like the fact that we are paying our way, therefore we must be subsidising other countries. That doesn't sit comfortably with me. And I think he has been very effective at putting pressure on other NATO members to step up. Has that shaken the foundations of NATO a little? Yes, possibly. Has he had to scare people into believing that America might walk away? Yes. Unfortunately, none of us know what's going on inside President Trump's head, but I do think this is part of him doing a deal, and he's been very successful at doing that. As for who pays for these weapons, don't forget America is a member of NATO. So if NATO are paying for them, America is also paying for them. But I go back to that principle that why wouldn't the rest of NATO, the other nations of NATO, pick up their fair share of the bill here? And that is not unreasonable to stop America having to pay for everything themselves, particularly since President Trump has made clear his focus is on the Indo-Pacific, it's on China. The rest of NATO, this war with Russia is on your doorstep. Frankly, you need to step up and do a little bit more.
A war that was begun by Russia. From Russia's point of view, they're saying they don't really care about what they're calling Donald Trump's theatrical ultimatum. That's what Dmitry Medvedev said this morning. Privately, though, how will the Kremlin, how will Putin be looking at all of this?
To be brutally honest, if I was a military advisor to Putin, I'd still be pretty delighted with the way it's going. Militarily, on the front line, the Russian forces are moving forward. It's a grinding war of attrition. We don't tend to see it in the news every day as we have done for the last three years, but it's no less brutal. The Russian forces are still piling on massive casualties. They're still pushing forward and gradually taking ground, even though it's a lot slower than most Western analysts thought was likely. Also, Russia is able to hit Kyiv and all the major capitals, it seems, with impunity. And of course, the one threat to President Putin, bluntly, he was trying to invade a country much smaller than Russia, much less well equipped. So the big threat to him, the strategic challenge for him, was to stop the West getting involved. Now, for the last couple of years, the West has been stepping up. But if you to look at it over the last 6 months, gradually America had stopped funding weapons. President Trump has seen a lot less stoical than President Biden had been about continuing support. The NATO allies, the rest of the European allies, are running out of weapons, bluntly. And all of a sudden, everybody was looking around at each other going, what do we do next? So if you were Russia, you'd be going, this is all going rather well, actually. So the real question is then, how much longer can Russia continue with its current push? I don't think they'll be that worried at all. The key worry they'll have is if America decides to throw its full weight behind this, and if it decides to use those tariffs, because that will now, as I said before, start to force President Putin's hand, that'll be something that will really turn the dial. At the moment, I very much doubt they're losing sleep over this.
So not losing sleep, but will there be a concern in Kyiv that there could be a time lag between the promise of this equipment, these batteries, these systems, and them arriving, the sort of lag in getting Ukraine better equipped?
Yeah, there's often an issue, but I have to say I've been out to Ukraine a couple of times, and certainly my understanding is that this isn't sort of coming in through one door and going straight out the other door, the weapons. They do keep a steady stockpile of stuff. You'll remember that when Congress, was it last year, they had several months where they hadn't approved the funding and the weapons stopped for several months. But there were stockpiles held by Ukraine. They were managing supplies and it didn't get to a critical time. So I think at the moment, yes, they'll never have enough weapons. But again, speaking bluntly, I suspect the problem that Ukraine's got at the moment is manpower. It hasn't got the same reserves of manpower that Russia does. One of the challenges where we send Ukraine lots of artillery shells and bullets is that the one war that Ukraine has to avoid is a grinding war of attrition. It's almost medieval. Two armies set on a battlefield, largely the bigger one wins. I know it's blunt, but actually, if you get involved over a war of attrition, Russia is likely to win. It doesn't mean you can't supply weapons like that to Ukraine, but it needs to have ready supply of people. And I think that's where it's hurting the most. It's particularly difficult if the West doesn't provide these high-tech weapons that allows Ukraine to fight differently, to start to strike Russia behind the front lines. That's where it creates the real advantage. And what the West needs to help them avoid getting involved in is this brutal grinding war, which bluntly Ukraine will not win.
We began by you mentioning that this shift in realization that perhaps Trump doesn't have the same level of trust in Putin that he did initially. Is the last 24 hours, is this all about the shift in tone from the White House? What can we read into? It seems the Trump-Putin relationship seems to be deteriorating.
Yeah, I have to say, the more I try to analyse Trump, the more I realise I don't recognise about him. I think it's worth saying, just to Trump's defence, I was chatting to a couple of my American military colleagues, and they were very quick to point out that President Trump won the election with a landslide. Yes, there's parts of America that will always vote Democrat, somewhat Republican. The swing states is where it gets decided, and he won all of those. And he won it on a mandate to deliver America first or whatever, and he's delivering on that agenda, no question. My American colleagues' point was, though, back in the UK, before you throw spears at President Trump, you also had a general election, which was also won by Sir Keir Starmer with an overwhelming majority, all based on an agenda that he got elected. Has any of that been delivered as yet? And his point was, the answer is no. So before you criticise President Trump, he's doing what he said he was going to do. I think in terms of the tone, the way that President Trump gets a lot of this stuff done is he appears to be breaking it to force people's hands to then rebuild it. I do sense the war in Ukraine, he said, should never have been started. I'll probably solve it before I even get into the office. Then he said it was going to be within a day, then 100 days. I think gradually his patience has run dry. He has managed to achieve, progress with NATO. He has managed to progress with the Iran war and others. I suspect his advisors are saying, just be careful with this one. You're not going to be able to solve this one by appeasing Putin. You're probably going to have to do something a little bit harsher. And I think that's the tone I sense, that he's gradually, reluctantly, recognising that he's been using carrots. It may be time to wield out a few sticks.
Sean Bell, thank you so much for your insight.
You're welcome.